Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the booth. Today, I am Captain Ian Carr, and today we're looking at something a little bit off of our Roman series to try to get us back into that before we jump into Advent, which I feel like is a lot of steps. But in the book of Romans, Paul works through a lot of the logic that comes against him as an apostle and as a preacher of the gospel. He sees things played out, sees logic played out in the way that people live around him, and he sees the logic played out in the things that are argued to him or against him by opposition and even by the church itself. And I think that one of the main functions of the book of Romans is to teach a world stuck in this current setting of the first century church, the logic behind what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And he does so by addressing counter logic in that culture. And one of the key functions to the book of Romans is giving Christians a backdrop as to why we follow God and how we enter into a relationship with God. And what I wanted to do this morning is just give us a bit of Old Testament context for how the relationship with a loving God exists, and the order and history of the grace that we enter that relationship into. And so I wanted to look at Exodus chapter 19 this morning, starting with verse 1, reading the first few verses. On the first day of the third month after Israel left Egypt, on that very day they came to the desert of Sinai. After they set out from Rephidim, they entered the desert of Sinai, and Israel camped there in the desert in front of the mountain. Then Moses went up to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. Now, if you obey me and fully keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words you are to speak to the Israelites." And so Moses went back and summoned the elders of the people and set before them the words of the Lord. The people of Israel all responded together, "We will do everything the Lord has said." So Moses brought their answer back to God. So here God makes a proposition to the Israelites to deepen their relationship with him and to become part of the covenant that he establishes in the book of Genesis with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so we see this loving God beckoning his people, contrasted with the latter half of Exodus 19 of God on the mountain and the terrifying presence of the Lord. But before we dive into this section, just think about what Israel has gone through, because there are some historical context here that makes this passage, I think, much more powerful and much more applicable to us. So Israel has spent the last several centuries in enslavement to the people of Egypt. They started off not slaves, obviously, given their own sort of chunk of Egypt to live and to dwell as shepherding people. And so even as slaves, that sort of shifts to this time where they are working in difficult conditions, performing harsh tasks at times, serving the Egyptians in all that they do. They still have a sort of a isolated home that they get to go to, but it is, under watch. It's still a slave life. It is in no way good, but there is a sense of a small identity that they have as the Israelite people as they go home. And so God comes to the Israelites after they have cried out and cried out and cried out to God. They are his chosen people as established with their patronage. And so Moses and God team up. Moses answers the call, and he goes to the Israelites and says, "Look, trust us. We are going to get out of here. God is going to take us into a land that is flowing with milk and honey. He's going to free us from the oppression of the Egyptians and give us a life of plenty. He is committed to do so. So let's just trust him and follow him. And so this is what happens. God frees them from the oppression of the Egyptians. And then he takes them not to a land flowing with milk and honey first. Alex Matier writes a commentary on the book of Exodus, and he's an incredibly deep theologian with this breadth of knowledge that I don't think I could ever have. And I feel like he lives with the map of Israel in the back of his head. And he says, think about this for a minute. God says, look, I'm going to promise you a land flowing with milk and honey. And some translations even say Palestine or Palestina, this kind of ancient region that has been named and updated into Palestine over history. And he says, I'm going to send you to this land, and this is what it's going to be for you. You know, we know where it is because of the rest of the Bible. Abraham was even shown it. He walked among it. They knew where it was vaguely. Hopefully a few of them hadn't forgotten. And they leave Israel and they go to they leave Egypt and they don't go to Israel, but they go to Sinai, which is further south than Egypt in the Sinai desert, in the Sinai wilderness, and is actually further away from the promised land. And so here comes God and he says, look, trust me, I'm going to take you into a land of bounty. Let's go to the desert the other direction though. And it's amazing to me because it seems like God's first lesson for the Israelites is trying to teach them the danger of self-reliance. And this is a sermon, I think, for another time, or a conversation for another time. But understand that despite the fact that the world today teaches us that self-reliance and independence is so important, we're created as a communal people, and we are created to rely on our Creator. And to be totally self-reliant is a dangerous thing. And so he takes the Israelites into the wilderness, and he creates this opportunity to proposition them to deepen their relationship with God. And it's really quite amazing that this is how he seeks to earn their trust. I have freed you. I'm going to send you to this bountiful place, but first let's go to the desert for a while. And so what we have is an amazing journey for Israel that starts in a difficult place and stays there. Now, I think there are some great parallels in most people's life between this story and their own. See, many people when they become Christian, especially I think if you become Christian at a young age, or you become Christian kind of, let's just say in the first half of your life, you will have a tendency to struggle through the understanding as the bounties and trials of Christian life. You see, we compare ourselves to others too much, but we think we are Christians, we are praying, and we are seeking the bounty of God. And what ends up happening is we're watching our life since we become a Christian maybe get harder and harder and harder, and more struggle appear in your life. And you think, I've given myself to God, what is going on? I remind you of the story of Joseph, who is in a family with lots of siblings. There's lots of kids in this family, whose father Jacob was married to a woman named Rachel, Joseph's mother, and also a woman named Leah, but he extremely overtly favored Rachel. And because Rachel had died, he also overtly and extremely favored Joseph over that of all of his brothers. In fact, the whole familial system of that time is broken because of his relationship with Joseph. It breeds contempt. Joseph is a spoiled kind of brat for the first part of this story. And by all reason, Joseph is heading down the path to becoming a pretty terrible person. And if you think about it, God could have shown up in front of Joseph and said, look at your life. You are going down a dangerous path. You are entitled and you are spoiled. You are going down a path where you're going to treat your family poorly. You're going to treat your spouse poorly. You're going to become in debt. You're going to anger your whole family. Who knows? You're going down this path of darkness. But it wouldn't have mattered, because you can tell anything to somebody about their sins, and they're not going to learn in that moment. An old theologian once said, nobody discovered they were a sinner because they were told they were. So instead, God leads Joseph through this journey where he is sold into slavery, and he somehow manages to work his way up to one of the probably best ways to be a slave. He's got some authority, he's got some respect, he's living probably as comfortable as a slave could, and then that is ripped out from underneath him, and he goes to jail, and he spends a few years in prison. And he does work his way through the ranks, trying to become more comfortable. Well, not trying to be, but becoming more comfortable. And as a result, when it comes time for him to do the work of God in Egypt, he is actually prepared in his character to do that. And so don't think of times of trial or times of struggle as separation from God, but as God leading you to something great. And that's also a conversation largely for another day. What God needed to see, though, in summary, is he needed to transform the souls of Joseph. He needed to transform the souls of his family and of his father to get them to the point where they would be his people. It couldn't just happen with instruction. This is kind of what's happening with Israel, and this is what happens with us. So Paul is fighting against and begging people in the book of Romans to learn the lesson that God is teaching here in Exodus 19. You see, Exodus 19 outlays the order and history of grace, as I mentioned earlier. And what we see is in verse 4, God highlights the saving acts of God. And then in verse 5, at least the first part of verse 5, we see the response of the Israelites of obedience. And then in the second part of verse 5, we see the blessings that are going to come from God from the obedient response. Now, think about this for a minute. This is the proper sequence of events. Alex Matier says, if anything upsets this sequence, we're bound for destruction. Nothing can upset this sequence of grace. God saves, we respond, and there is blessing. I think that a lot of Christians compare themselves to others too much. In fact, in probably the worst ways. You may have been at a point in your life where you think, look, I am praying, I'm reading my Bible every day, I've practiced good self-control, I'm tithing, I'm helping the poor, I'm doing everything right, but life is not getting better. I don't feel the blessings of God. I don't see this happening. But my friend over here, they don't seem to have a great deal of self-control. They don't seem to be tithing. I don't think they're praying or reading their Bible every day, but things seem to be going great for them. If you have ever compared yourself like this to somebody, chances are you have the sequence wrong. And we need to be very careful about this. You see, the first thing that happens in this is God saves. And there is a huge difference between somebody that obeys, seeking acceptance, versus somebody that is accepted and obeys. And this is what Paul is preaching and teaching against for the breadth of Romans. The world is full of people seeking acceptance through obedience. But that's not how God sets things up. See, the first thing God does is he takes Israel out of Egypt. He saves them from their oppression. And then he says, look, if you obey me, I will make you my treasured possession, a priesthood of believers, a nation of priests, and a holy people, a holy nation. First, God does what he would do to anything he treasures. He does what any person would do to something that they treasure. He goes to great lengths to save them. And so it's interesting, and I think very important to recognize that first God saves, and then he says, look, if you obey me, you'll be my treasured possession. He clearly already treasures us. So what's the difference? You see, this phrase, my treasured possession, and I think some of the sentences that come after it in English, they refer very specifically to the private wealth, the personal wealth of ancient kings. You see, back in this time, and for millennia after, you think of the ancient kings and pharaohs and emperors of old, and you think of their power and their wealth. Everything that a king or an emperor conquered was their dominion. It was all theirs. Everything that they had and that their people had technically belonged to them. But this phrase speaks of their personal wealth, the things that they treasured and held dear, that they would keep in their room, that they would give their time and energy to, that they held dear. We are all God's treasures. He is the creator of the universe. But if we obey him, we enter into a relationship as a treasured possession. And the thing is, God says, look, if you keep my covenant, I mean, he's already done it. Like, he's already committed and covenanted to be our God. And he's kind of saying, like, look, these blessings exist, but if you obey me, you will see them fulfilled. And maybe we can treasure each other then. So God calls the Israelites into this relationship and says, look, if you keep my covenant, if you obey me, then you will be my treasured possession. And what ends up happening here is the obedience to God comes out of the love of his character, of his person, of what he's done for you. There's typically a couple different kinds of Christians, of followers of Jesus. Those that obey and hope to get to a point where they feel they're worthy of acceptance and therefore accepted. And those that obey because they have been accepted. And their obedience is driven by love, where the first person's obedience is driven by fear and doubt and shame. There's a big difference. In the church world, we call this more often than not legalism. But it is just one of many forms of getting this sequence wrong. And it's so important to get it right, because the New Testament is sort of a picture of a nation that has gotten it wrong. They've gotten it so wrong, they've said, look, here's the law of God, nothing goes past it. And they get to the point where the rabbis say, and the rabbinical teachings say, our law, we've learned so much from the law of God, our law is more important, it's better than the law of God. And it has become such a problem that they totally miss Jesus when he shows up. And so we need to be very careful to keep this sequence in order, not just because it helps us avoid legalism, but because it helps us become a passionate, loving people of God that are seeking to obey him because we love him. Think about what happens when you fall in love with somebody. You seek to understand what makes them happy. Is there something that you can give them? Is there something that you can do for them? Is there something that you can do at all to help fulfill this desire, this need, this thing that makes them happy? Right? If you've ever fallen in love, then you understand this. But it's not that hard to imagine if you haven't. For example, this is kind of a weird, selfish example, I think, but I know that my wife, after 9 years of marriage, loves cheesecake. That she specifically loves cheesecake from the Cheesecake Factory. And so a couple years ago, we had the twins, and that took a toll. And so one week, the kids had a doctor's appointment, and they were getting their shots, and she does not like being there for that. It's very traumatic for her. So I took all the kids to the doctor. They got their shots, which they usually slept after for a while, and then snuck away, took all the family, except for my wife, to Tulsa, to the Cheesecake Factory, and bought her a cheesecake for her birthday. That was a couple days away. Now, at the time and in hindsight, that doesn't really seem like a big deal. Like, she loves cheesecake, and I wanted to make her happy with that. In hindsight, with the shots and the babies, and it was a strange challenge, I guess. There's a better phrase for this, though, other than just trying to learn what, learn what they like and give it to them. Another way of saying this is that you are seeking to do their will, right? If somebody really loves something, You love them, you learn what that thing is, and you try to fulfill it. This is doing the will of the person you love. And this is what God is sort of proposing. He says, look, we will treasure each other. And as a result, because you have fallen in love with God, you are now doing whatever you can to see to it that the things that he loves, that he's passionate about, that he cares about, are fulfilled. And what he treasures is humanity. And he sets out his will for us to go and help others enter into this treasured, loving relationship with God, to become part of this kingly possession. These are the blessings that come. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is we usually teach to people that you have to accept the sacrifice of Jesus because he loved you enough to save you so that you don't go to hell. And while, yeah, that's true, it's sort of a happy byproduct. It's a side note in a lot of ways. God doesn't save us so that we don't go to hell. He saves us because he loves us. And if we understand that, we step back from the legalistic do this and don't do that. We step back from the misunderstanding that the blessings that are coming are going to be financial, or they're going to be material, or they're going to be something other than a deeper relationship with the presence of God or with the person of God. And the church explodes because it is full of people whose main desire and earnest desire in life is to go and help other people experience the love of God. It doesn't matter if their congregation grows. It doesn't matter if their tithing goes up. It doesn't matter if people see them as successful. Whatever reason people think that they have to do evangelism or the work of God, none of that matters. All that matters is it is God, the one who loves us and treasures us. It is his desire to share that love with the world. And as Christians and as people who enter into a relationship where God says, if you obey me, you will be my treasured possessions. I have done all the work to save you and to eliminate any need for guilt or recompense. Just come and enjoy my love. Then you will do everything within your power to enjoy the love of God, to reciprocate the love of God, and to take it to those around you. This is the foundation of the order of grace. First, God saves. We obey, and we experience the blessings promised from God. You'll probably notice that there were two other things in the list that God promises of blessings: treasured possession, a priesthood of believers, and a holy people. Well, I kind of touched on all those things without using their titles. But really quick, a treasured possession is what we sort of focused on. You become a treasured possession of God. And as a treasured possession of God, as somebody who is reciprocating the love of God and seeking to do his will, what you end up doing is being a priesthood of believers, taking the message of God, the love of God to the world, and facilitating the connection between God and another human. That's what a priest does. Helps people find that connection. And a holy people is just somebody who is different than the world around them, somebody who is God's people that are a different people because this world is broken and we have been made whole. And so this morning, my challenge is that maybe two parts. One, that you step back from whatever logic or reason that caused you to become a follower of God, if it was logic and reason and not this, not the love of God. And spend some time in prayer, in your word, seeking the treasured possession of God in your life, seeking to feel that and to enjoy it. It's a difficult time. There's a pandemic. It's Christmas. Right now it's raining and gross outside. Like, there's a lot of reasons to feel glum. But none of them pale in comparison to the joy and to the power of being a treasured possession of God, knowing what you need to do every day to please the one that treasures you. And my other challenge is, look, you have been saved by God, whether you're aware of it or not. Stop evaluating yourself based on what other people are doing. Stop worrying about whether or not you are being blessed or not in the ways that others are. Just seek God. He has called us to him. He has promised us. He has already saved us. All we need to do is seek to deepen that relationship, to become a treasured possession, and to let that experience wash over us. And so in the coming weeks, read through Exodus 19. Read through the book of Romans and look at the fact that God treasures us and we are promised an amazing life with him from now until he comes, or from now until we go to heaven, and then beyond. And revel in the joy and the love that is the treasuring God.